So we're delighted today to have two of the world's leading experts on water, Dr. Coase-Sandor and Professor Daniel Tarlock. And we actually have a third expert in Professor Mark Templeton. As you know, issues regarding water and water markets are incredibly timely. The news is filled with stories, particularly from the West and California, about the difficulties and challenges of water. To give you just a couple of examples, Lake Mead, which is near Las Vegas and supplies water to California and Arizona, is now between only 35 and 40% of its capacity. Another example, the Salton Sea, which is a 350-mile inland sea in the Sonoran Desert that provides a valuable resting and feeding spot for migratory birds. That's a particular interest of mine. It's anticipated to lose 60% of its volume in the next 15 years. That's not only going to be bad for the birds, but it's going to cause many fish to die, create foul odors, and increase the risk of asthma for children in the area. So you may have heard that California Governor Jerry Brown has attempted to slow the rate of decline in these sources through a combination of voluntary and mandatory restrictions. But here at the University of Chicago, we often try to solve problems by looking at markets, and particularly by looking at establishing property rights. And our inquiries into markets and regulation and property rights are made possible not just with respect to water, but with respect to all our inquiries through the Coase-Sandor Institute. And so I want to thank Dr. Sandor and his wife Ellen for their generosity in founding the Institute. And we're very grateful to them. And it's entirely appropriate then that Dr. Sandor and Professor Tarlock lead our discussion today. So as I mentioned, we've got a third expert who's going to moderate for us, Professor Mark Templeton, who, as you all know, directs our Abrams Environmental Law Clinic. But you may not know that in addition, before coming to us, he was director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources and a cabinet member in the Missouri government of Governor Jay Nixon. So we have three experts today. We're very fortunate to have them. Please welcome them. Great.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm Mark Templeton, and I'm the least of the three experts. So my job initially is to just underscore how lucky we are to have Dr. Sandor and Professor Tarlock here today by telling you a little bit more about their backgrounds. Then Dr. Sandor will speak. Professor Tarlock will comment. I will have the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question, but then very much look forward to your questions as well, because critical inquiry is a critical part of the University of Chicago Law School, and we've got the panelists here who can handle those kinds of difficult questions. Dr. Sandor is currently Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Environmental Financial Products. It was the predecessor company and incubator to Chicago Climate Exchange, the European Climate Exchange, and the Chicago Climate Futures Exchange. In October 2007, Dr. Sandor was honored as one of Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment for his work as the father of carbon trading. He drew on a tremendous experience in the futures market and the development of financial products. And if you really want to understand what it means to launch a market and how difficult it is and how exhilarating it is, I highly recommend his book, Good Derivatives, to you. I worked in finance. It was gripping to understand actually what happens. He also authored this book, Sustainable Investing in Environmental Markets, Opportunities in New Asset Class, which I also recommend to you today, and which he'll be drawing from for his remarks as well. Before I turn it over to Dr. Sandor, I want to introduce Professor Dan Tarlock. I could not lift the books that Professor Tarlock has written on water. My muscles are not strong enough. Countless case books, other treatises as well, including water resource management, environmental law, law of water rights and resources, environmental protection law and policy. He is a professor of law at the IIT Chicago-Kent faculty for several decades, and he is the chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee to Study Water Management in the Western U.S., principal writer of the Western Water Policy Review Advisory Committee, and on standing NRC committees to advise U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So I'm going to step out of the way and turn it over to Dr. Sandor.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I'm going to talk in as casual a way as I can to you all and with you all. The University of Chicago is not a better place to discuss water markets given the birth of lawn economics here and the fact that markets have been initiated and employed to solving problems relating to externalities. I'm sure all of you know what an externality is, but just for purposes of completeness, it's really a spillover. Either it's negative or positive that occurs outside the production of the firm. So air pollution is typically one. Of course, the famous externalities is covered in Professor Coase's article in The Theory of Social Costs, in which a train goes through a farm, throws off sparks, and because the owner of the train doesn't have to pay for the negative externalities, production or train runs are at higher levels. The positive externality, typically the example is bees and beekeepers and farmers, and the bees pollinate, so it's in the best interest of the farmer to have a positive externality and a beekeeper to be next to a farm, and the spillover benefits. But when you have these externalities, the market solution fails because of optimization occurs at the unit level and not at the macro level. So how do you deal with, these externalities, and what are the alternatives? And the alternatives are pretty simple. They are basically command and control, much of which Jerry Brown is now instituting. You mandate something, either generally or specifically. So you mandate perhaps a 10% cut in production, or you have prescriptive things that you say entities must use. And that is generally referred to as command and control. An alternative to that is to price the externality. So let's say, for an example, you mandate a 10% cut in water usage or emissions or something of that nature, and that's a command and control. But there is something that evolved out of that 60 article into what is known as cap and trade. And that is where you cut by a certain percentage systemically, 10% across the board, water usage, air pollution, etc. And those people that basically, because of technology, they're not able to do it quickly, can comply, they can buy somebody else's reduction. So if it's Richard Power Company, and Richard Power Company is not very efficient, and he has to build some kind of technology abatement devices, but Templeton, Power Company can easily change its technology. It produces reductions of more than 10%, and then Richard Power buys those reductions from Templeton Power. So it's basically that simple. So what are the kind, and the point of explaining that is to say water fits into one of those examples, but I want to do a little steps beforehand. So we were involved in the late 1980s in the first acid rain program. And if you looked at the Clean Air Act of 1990 and its amendments, it allowed for cap and trade. It's very interesting from all of your points because the legislation never says cap and trade. It is not anywhere identified. It just allows for the allocation of certain rights to emit. and says they're transferable, but it no longer does anything more than that, and it allows, it's enabling legislation which now allows the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to eliminate or to allocate. Now, the program was poo-pooed at the time. And for those of you who may want to study this, you will be specifically led to a paragraph in the legislation which says these are not property rights. Hear this clearly, because everything that we read about and study says you have to have clear property rights for a market to work. The legislation said this is not a property right. And in fact, it says it's a quasi-property right. So we have some indication that what is clear and what is unambiguous didn't exist in the acid rain program. At that time, there were 18 million tons emitted of SO2. When you burn coal, you get four pollutants, one of them being carbon, the other sulfur, NOx, and mercury. Sulfur goes in the air, combines with oxygen, you get SO2, get water in the mix, and you get acid rain. So the program, in spite of the quasi-property right nature of it, emissions were cut from 18 million tons to 3 million tons. The program broke down because Congress did not renew the act. That's number one. Number two, the cost of the program is estimated by the EPA to be $1 to $3 billion, and the annual medical savings, the medical benefits associated with the reduction in acid rain are $123 billion a year. So the cost benefit is about as outstanding as you can ever get in any program. More than that, about 35,000 lives a year are saved. That's number one. Number two. And three, none of these benefits include benefits associated with beauty in forest and neutering of forests. It contains none of those benefits. So the program has been extraordinarily successful. That's the message. It doesn't have clearly defined property rights. It has quasi-property rights. And managed to be the most successful program ever. Okay, how do you know, and how do you get to a point if you know it's ripe? Okay, the leader of the panel said it's timely. Tom said it's timely, and it is timely. So if you take a look at the history of markets, you generally have 7 stages which you can spot pregnancy, which provides an opportunity professionally, commercially, etc. Number one is a big structural change. And that's followed with the properties and defining what the commodity is. Then after that, we trade evidence of ownership. So you need evidences of ownership, whether it's corn or air or water. Then you get over-the-counter trading. Then you get exchanges. And then ultimately you get derivatives. So you have a 7-stage process in which you go through. So the hypothesis is here for water. Okay, the structural change is the population of this planet. We have 3% of the world's water is fresh water, and even less of that is potable. So we really are in a situation, and everywhere you look, whether it's China, 25% desertification, 90% of the rivers polluted. You look at the western United States, you look at northern Africa, and the creeping of the Sahara. There's only 3 continents in the world that are long water, and that's North America, South America, and Europe. Africa's short, India's short, China's short, the Middle East is short, and a good part of Africa is short. Water trading already exists, okay, except it's virtual water. And what do I mean by virtual water? Every time you consume a pound of corn, you're using 108 gallons of water. You have a pound of chicken, that's roughly 500 gallons of water. And if you have a 1 pound steak, it's about 1,800 gallons of water. And so the grain trade is really a proxy for international trading of water. And so it exists vis-a-vis the water embodied in it. And is this hypothetical? No, there are several people now that are launching and planning to launch water indexes. They're coming based on virtual water. And it's a way to take a non-transportable commodity and figure out how to define it. So let me, in the last thing, dispel another myth and then talk about water, and then I'm going to leave it to my colleague who's going to do all the heavy lifting on all of that. Number one, the other thought process is that to have a successful market, you need government action, okay? And clearly, Coase spoke a lot about this with the lighthouse. Anytime you have, a externality, the thought process was you need government to do some mandation. In his articles, he argued, no, not necessarily, and I want to tell you about some experiment that was an experiment that turned out to be very viable, and that was the Chicago Climate Exchange, which we founded. And we got abused, ridiculed, because we said we're going to set up a voluntary program in the United States, and we're going to get commercial companies to enter into a private contracts to reduce emissions by 6% over a 6-year period. And like the lighthouse, everybody said that's not possible, that nobody's going to join it, there's free riders, etc. We ended up with 108 emitters, a baseline of carbon emissions bigger than Germany. Founding members included DuPont, American Electric Power, International Paper, Ford Motor Company, Intel, 20% of the country's power companies, IBM, etc. And they reduced emissions far more than their target, so you can do it. Why do I say that? Because we have talked with several entities about financing a water exchange that would be all voluntary, having the evidence that you can do something in a voluntary way, even though there are externalities. So in the last 2 minutes, let me kind of tell you about two kind of markets, and then my colleague can bridge the gap, or I want to segue into his talk. We've been involved in 3 efforts, one in Alberta, Canada, where the Canadians will run out of water before they run out of oil. Okay, so that's a problem. and basically, we did a feasibility study there. There's a very fine scientist who heads the Alberta Water Research Institute, and under his guise, and we did a feasibility study. It didn't go anywhere. Perhaps it will change with the change in Canadian governments, but that was a regional effort. We also took a look at water trading for the Great Lakes under a grant from the Joyce Foundation. Now, before you can trade anything, you've got to measure it. You may be surprised to find, I was, that you can draw all of the water you want out of Lake Michigan by just getting a permit. It's free. It's a zero cost. It's not monitored. Nobody knows what the basin does. And it contains 20% of the world's fresh water supply, roughly, and there are no limitations on withdrawals and no laws regarding it, and the only cost is piping it from the lakes to suburban communities who basically drill, deplete the underground water supply, etc. So that was the second, and the third was in New Mexico, and let me end with that. And in New Mexico, you cannot, there's no real trading of water rights. An acre foot of water that is 1 foot high, spread over an acre. You use 623 acre feet of water to produce $250,000 worth of alfalfa. Intel, with that amount of water, is what it uses in its chip plant in Albuquerque, and it produces 5,500 jobs and $600 million in payroll, and yet the farmer can't sell the water rights to Intel. So the gains from trade are enormous. Where is there success? There's really success in Australia in the Murray-Darling Basin. And recent reports suggest that $380 million has been added by a water quantity program there to the GDP of the state. It's been a remarkable success. It's got lots of different kinds of water, seasonal water, permanent water, less permanent water. But the markets have worked very successfully, and all agree. So I think the opportunities are enormous, both for quantity markets and quality markets. I think those of you who are contemplating careers, I happen to think desertification is even more timely and relevant than climate change, and of course they are related. But, you know, it's the old, I think it's Mark Twain, you know, is whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting, okay? And the politics of water, if you've seen the movie Chinatown or seen anything else, are enormous. But the point to make is it is being implemented successfully in Australia. And with that, let me pass the baton to my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's always an honor to come down to the law school. It's also really a daunting challenge. I visited here for a year when probably most of your parents were in high school. It's the only place where I've taught or lectured when I was really relieved when the class was over, because the students had wrung everything I had to say about the subject out of me, and I really didn't have anything more to say. All right, let me now turn to water rights. So let me start by saying that I'm sure that the late Ronald Coase was very upset that God did not add an 11th commandment to keep transaction costs low. But speaking as a water lawyer, I have to make 2 points. But first I want to say the consensus is that Mark Twain never uttered those words.
Oh, is that right?
I once spent 2 hours on the web tracing it down, and the consensus is somebody else made it up. But there have been murders over water rights, so I suppose it's okay. So let me say 2 things, as I say, speaking as a water lawyer. First of all, we bottom-feeder lawyers live off transaction costs. So we need high, not low transaction costs. But second, more pertinent to this discussion, the law of water rights is wired for transaction costs. Water rights are property rights, so they're not like the SO2 rights. They're harder property rights. But here's the problem, and let me take a simple example. Let's say you own a piece of land and a house, and it has nice shade trees that shade your neighbor's house and cut down on his or her heating, air conditioning bills in the summer. So let's say that you want to sell your house and you sell it to someone who hates trees. Suppose your neighbor objects. Under the law of property, you can tell your neighbor where to go. That neighbor has no interest in your property and what you do when you sell it, and unless you can really raise some sort of nuisance argument, can't object. On the other hand, in a water right, water rights are transferable, but the rub is that because they're on a body of moving water, to take a stream, they're correlative. One person's use depends on another person's use. So most water is used for irrigated agriculture. That's what's transferred for the economic reasons that you just set out. But when you take water out of the stream to grow a crop, some of it goes into the crop, but another amount of water returns to the stream, and it goes downstream, and other people take it out and grow. So when you transfer a water right, what you can transfer is not the total amount that you've taken out, but only the amount that you've actually consumed in growing the crop. And other users have well-established rights to demand that the amount that was returned still be in the stream so they can use it. And so this translates into high transaction costs. I only have one visual here. I was cleaning out my office recently and came across a 1988 study, 1989, Transferring Water Rights in the Western States, a comparison of policies and procedures. So even if your eyesight is not so good, in my third year of law school, the A and B's disappeared from the board. But anyway, here's a diagram of the water rights transfer process in Colorado. And I may have missed one, but I count 35 possible steps to the transfer process, and that leads to high transaction costs. Now, let me close on a positive note, but to reiterate this theme. As I said, water markets are possible. Water rights are property rights. There are transaction costs, but they can be overcome. States have taken some steps to improve the information base, which is crucial to the transfer process. But they're still different from other types of property rights because of these third-party interests. And not only are there legal third-party interests, other users, water rights also are protested by people who are worried about the impact, even though they have no legal interest. Because in the West, when you do transfer water, usually from agriculture to urban or industrial use, what you're really doing is retiring land. You're taking land out of agriculture production, and that has enormous community impacts that sometimes are addressed, sometimes not addressed. So that's the rub with water rights. A lot of people have thought that they would make a lot of money transferring water, but I think that's still in the future. I just have to say, probably about 15 years ago, I did write a long memo setting out all these points to the CSX on transfer of water rights in the Great Lakes, and was happy to take some of the Joyce Foundation's money to do it. So I take it's now time to open things up, right?
Great. So I'd like to start off by asking a question about how do we get from where we are today to what the future might look like, and maybe your experience working with the utilities on SO2 or would bear on this. In the sense that, at least in that context, you already had the utilities who were polluting, and had certain technologies and had made certain investments, had certain expectations, capital budgets, approvals from public utility commissions to conduct businesses in a certain kind of way. And they had to wrap their heads and business model around this new way of doing things with some risks that maybe it wouldn't work. Here, it sounds like you have that problem and maybe some additional levels of complexity in terms of the correlative rights. Maybe the markets are not quite as big because the SO2 market would have been basically the Midwest and the Northeast. Here, it might be smaller, maybe more geographically constrained. So can you, based on some of your experiences, Dr. Sandor, can you give us a sense of how we might go sort of from where we are today to actually implementing this?
I don't think we are. I didn't mention this, we're launching a new exchange a week from Friday called the American Financial Exchange, which is going to be an alternative to LIBOR. Okay, we found a way to competitively set it as opposed to it's currently being fixed. And so we had been working on water up until this opportunity came along, and we decided to set up a centralized market for interbank lending and to have weekly auctions to determine what we call Ameribor, the American Interbank Offering Rate. London has LIBOR, Europe has Euribor, China has Chibor. There's no American interest rate. Largest economy in the world, and there's no benchmark here. So we took a side because, very candidly, the commercial opportunities looked a lot bigger in what we were doing, and the lifting, although it's a heavy lift as it is for any new market, it can be done. But what we had done in water, we think it makes it easy to implement a market. Those 35 steps, my colleague is right. But with, the technology today, a hitting of a bid or lifting of an offer compresses that, and a rule book of 500 pages compresses those 35 steps, and they can be automated instantaneously. That's what exchange rule books do. They provide for complex processes. And I think the 11th commandment is the right way to look at it. When you establish a market, you look at 4 buckets of transaction costs. One of it is the enabling legislation. The second is the regulatory bucket. The third is design of the institution of the exchange itself, and how do you make this the most efficient regulator. And then the fourth is the design of the contract. Should it be an acre feet, not an acre feet, traded in dollars, liters, all kinds of complex technicalities. And everything that we've done, and I will get back to it, suggests that you can do it. We launched the Chicago Climate Exchange, and just the monitoring and verification and authenticity, we came up with some ways to get around those 35 steps. We monitored Germany, or the equivalent 800 million tons of carbon, plus carbon sequestration in land, plus forests, plus methane reduction through animal waste, blah, 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 blah. We have a witness to it here, Tanya. And we did it for $2 million a year. Okay, the federal government is estimating that it will cost billions to monitor carbon in the United States. And we have some experience that suggests it's $2 million for a country the size of Germany if you do it right. And so I think it's the experience that we had at the Chicago Climate Exchange saying, and dealing with offsets, which you don't have in water, by the way. You do have it in carbon, but measuring sequestration in below-ground roots of wheat is a daunting problem, or in forests, or taking animal waste and methane, or doing it, any of those things. These look like they're complex, but they just require institution building. And while the standard arguments say it's very complex, to somebody who has, been on from the Jurassic era, and there was a time when everybody in this city said you couldn't commoditize money. And I happen to have been involved in the development of financial futures, and everybody said you can't do it. It has to be a storable agriculture or metal commodity. None of that's possible. So I think that this class and these groups of people and the academic talent here could sit around, build consensus for a year, and launch a voluntary water market, and probably even launch a market where property rights are not clear, like in New Mexico, because 85% are adjudicated. And you don't have, while you have clear property rights, they're not clear because they're all adjudicated. So but that doesn't matter either. The power of price in changing behavior is just phenomenal. And the arguments that you hear against it are, I think, oftentimes specious, and just like lawyers, love the complications of transaction costs, environmental advocates love the fact that, and they get supported by lots of people who make their jobs of interest to not solve the problem. In my particular belief, you're supposed to want to put yourself out of business if you're doing good, right? If you're the Cancer Foundation, you want to cure it and get out of the business, right? But there's a lot of advocacy groups that their jobs depend on the problems not being solved. And at the University of Chicago, we know about incentives. They do change behavior. And so I don't think it's all that big a deal. And I think that you could create a multi-billion-dollar exchange, and you could solve the problems, and you could do well financially, and you can do enormous social value. I don't think they're incompatible.
Dan, do you want to comment on that, or?
Just a couple things. First of all, I counted the last 11 steps in the Colorado change process are the judicial process, from the trial process to the Supreme Court. So if those are going to be automated, you have a good case against the law school for fraud here.
No, but
we're going to be out of jobs.
I'll make a very important case on this. So Ronald Coase was a friend of mine and a teacher of mine, and he had, where everybody at the journal rejected it. He was the editor for a journal of law and economics. I wrote an article on financial innovation. I ended up, long story, being chief economist for the Chicago Board of Trade. And I got to Chicago, invited him down to tour the floor, and he couldn't believe that essentially that trillions of dollars changed hands and the judicial process was de minimis, okay? There were people doing this, two-bid at 4, 10 million to sell, 10 million to buy, 100 to buy, two-bid at 4, 100, done, sold, all of that. And it's $2 billion later, and the adjudication process is a committee of 5 members, and you get to it. By the way, the Chicago Board of Trade, differences between members take precedence over the Illinois Supreme Court. So there are lots of ways to get around, legal processes that are inefficient, and sometimes effective lobbying will lose jobs in the judicial process, but the efficiencies gained from a uniform rule book are enormous. So I think you've got to look at how things can be, not how they are. And when you design an exchange, you design it with an idea about cutting down legal costs and basically unrolling a judicial process or compounding a judicial process into basically a very efficient dispute resolution process. And it need not be at the government level. It's worked with every exchange, which is the envy of the world, from the New York Stock Exchange in 1792. All of these operated before the SEC and the CFTC. So I think we can't think within the law. We have to think beyond the law, or what the law ought to be normatively, not what it is now. So I very believe that strongly, and that if the legal community and the economists got together, they could design some very efficient processes.
Let me just add two more complications, then I'll shut up. A lot of the work I do now is in the international level, and at the international level, there's a huge, really philosophical or theological debate, however you want to characterize it, about the nature of water. Is it a commodity or is it a service and not a commodity? So there are deeper philosophical questions here with water that I don't think you have with money, where the issues are more technical. Can you do it? Second thing, I just want to provide a little historical context. Since the 1960s, economists started to look at Western agriculture and said too much water is being put into marginal crops. You got to have markets here. Move this water into the cities where people are moving, and a lot of that has happened. But in my experience, when you go into the West and talk to a lot of irrigators, farmers, ranchers, and you say, markets are good. You've got these property rights, plus a lot of the water is heavily subsidized, and that's not good, so it'd be better to move it to the market level. What I found is that the farmers want two things. They want subsidized water, they want firm, constitutionally protected property rights, but you don't want markets. And you tell them, wait a minute. Milton Friedman, Ronald Coase say you have to have all. If you have property rights, you shouldn't have subsidies and you should have markets. And then they don't like it. And then they start to talk like Native Americans about their cultural heritage and why they should be left alone. So there's some real problems. But anyway.
We have an honest intellectual difference, and I defer to you on your water knowledge and expertise.
No, I'm just. Yeah.
But I do believe, I heard this in 1992. I heard in 1980 you could never trade SO2. Then in 1992 the Rio Summit came along, and you said you don't understand. Carbon's different than sulfur.
Yeah.
Sulfur wasn't money, but you could never trade air, okay? Then it got to carbon, and everybody said, okay, carbon's really different. It's different than any other commodity, and I'm not sure the air is different than the water. And if you can solve it in carbon, you can solve it in water. The issue is that the people who have vested interest may not want to solve it, and I agree with you 100%.
There's some deeply entrenched vested interest.
Deeply entrenched vested interest, and we share that. That's your frustration and my frustration, because, listen, if you have these vested interests, you're not going to want to change, and particularly in a world that we live in when everybody expects to get economic rent. And certainly trying to rob somebody of economic rent. And the arguments are really easy, because when you say trading water, everybody gets tensed up, right? But I can't live. No, we don't mean that. You only need 25 gallons a day for hydration and hygiene. The city of Chicago, we use 150 gallons a day per capita. They've used 175 gallons a day. We're talking about trading that water in excess of human right for hydration and hygiene. We're talking about the person that takes a 2-hour recreational shower. And that's fine, just pay for it, okay? I think that's what you want to do. You want to go in there for 2 hours? God bless you, do it, except put $3 into the meter, and then you can take your shower.
So I guess my only comment would be I would be very wary of treating any group as monolithic and having a single set of views, whether it's farmers or environmentalists or anybody else. On that note, I'd like to open it up for questions. Yes.
So I'm just wondering, maybe you guys can clarify. I'm a little bit confused. You're talking about markets for water rights, namely the idea is the government may provide some kind of limit that then can be traded. But I was kind of hoping for something more, maybe markets in water. Why can't there be private production of water through purification and desalination that is sold to people and the government has nothing to do with it? Why can't water be like telecommunications? I understand that there is one grid that water needs to flow through, but that's a simple problem to solve. The source should be competitive. So I'd like to see water markets not only allocate water to better users, but solve the scarcity problem. I mean, the oceans are full of water, just longing to be desalinated.
But Reef, if you put a price on that, everything else will follow. I mean, that's a University of Chicago answer. But the fact is that putting a price on corn resulted in corn surplus areas in Missouri, building grain elevators because the Cargills of the world recognized that the local prices fell relative to the central marketplace, and you could build a grain elevator there and profit from the ability to store because you could lock in the thing. So I think pricing of water with is going to go to your colleagues in the Department of Nanotechnology that are doing the ultimate research here at the University of Chicago on reverse osmosis and desalinization. And they tell me there's a long way to go on getting the efficiency up. And that they could basically improve the efficiency of desalinization by 50%. Now, if they had a water component to it, a price, that they could sell the current technology versus the new technology, you would stimulate that research a lot more, and you would have perhaps the doing. So I think you get the trading of water synthetically without having to trade the water or move the water, because a price would do it, just like building, you get local prices in Missouri and North Carolina, it generates the buildup of capital, physical capital, because there's profit in it. Imagine if you could put the price on what clean water would do, what would it do to the research in nanotechnology, and what would it do to the ability to build a desalinization plant? So, I'm not sure they aren't the same. I don't know that they are, but I know you get a lot of benefits that you're referring to from trading the rights.
So in the West, my understanding is that there's dramatically different laws from state to state. So Arizona has a groundwater law, California doesn't, and there's big consequences of this. I'm curious whether or not to have a functioning market, whether or not it could be compatible with the current system of state-by-state water rules. That is, do you need a national law like the Clean Air Act to come in for water law to make it standardized across states before this could function?
Look, I differ, and look, there's some very important meetings going on in Paris as we speak, and everybody believed that the Kyoto Protocol had to be binding and extend to all countries because of free riding, because of all of the things we talk about. I don't believe that's necessary. We believe that plurilateral markets and by that I mean there'll probably be a carbon market in Europe, maybe one in China, one in India, maybe the U.S. will get around to it someday or won't, but California and China are enough to lead the way, and trading results in a uniformity, just like you have in the debt market. You have government risk-free debt, then you have AAA, all the way down to BBB, and then junk, and you trade off a base mark. Mortgages are traded off the 10-year. And so I think that you can get, and once the spread, and we should know the law, in other words, if California and Arizona had a market which differed, there would be a spread on the value of water in each of those. And arbitrage over the long run would keep it. That's how it works with interest rates. That's how it works with crude oil. You got Middle Eastern sour, you got Brent, you got West Texas Intermediate, and there's no uniform grade of oil, but they all trade within a spread, just like hard red winter and spring wheat. Cookie wheat, bread wheat, and pasta wheat are totally different. But if they get out of line by grade differences, then they get in line by efficient capital markets. And I go back to my colleague's 11th commandment. The idea is when you set up markets is to minimize transaction costs and to allow arbitrage to normalize the difference between regulatory regimes. So we will see at some particular point, in my opinion, and we've got carbon priced in New Jersey, the regional greenhouse, we've got it priced in California, we've got it priced in Europe, and we'll have it, and we have it priced in 7 exchanges in China. And we will learn the difference by the price spreads of what the cost of tighter constraints is or more liberal trading regimes. The markets reveal a lot by price differentials. So if you look at cotton trading, oil trading, debt trading, it's all about differentials as a trader or somebody who has traded. And differentials will reveal to you the difference between regulatory environments. So you would have junk water, if the regulations like junk bonds are not very good, and you'd probably have a lower price of water, and it would be junk water compared to a better regulatory framework where the water, might be priced very differently.
There's a question back there, yes.
But the first part of my question is, do you believe that the privatization of water will continue to increase in the future? And so how will that influence the market that you propose for water?
What do you mean by privatization?
Coca-Cola buying freshwater reserves, things like that.
So again, if people wouldn't hear, the question was, what about the privatization of water, such as Coca-Cola buying freshwater reserves?
I don't have an intelligent answer. I'm not sure, what it was. But all I know is that people who try to integrate their companies, utilities that bought coal mines, etc., all of that, it generally turns out that the transactions costs are higher than they're being independent. I mean, what we know is these conglomerates don't necessarily, or this complete integration doesn't necessarily work. That was Henry Ford's idea, right? He wanted to control the sand on the lake so he could get it into glass. He wanted to control the iron ore so he could make it into steel. And it turns out that the transactions costs were higher for that model than separate ownerships along buckets. So I'm I'm not disturbed about that.
I mean, one thing, water in most of the world, the water has always been privatized. That is, despite the lot of law about the public nature and so forth, but most countries have allowed private rights, and countries that did not, for a long time, allow private rights are moving in the private direction. China's the best example. I once was taken to a dam there, and I just asked, why did they pick this spot? And somebody said, well, in the 50s, Mao came out and pointed. They flooded the valley and moved the farmers away and all that. But now China has a quite complicated water law. They're experimenting with markets. So that, I think water rights definitely will be the future, and that's basically private.
And I think, just to amend that, I agree totally that you really, and we do talk about that at great lengths. I think that we are going to be very surprised. It's not going to happen here because of vested interests. Okay, carbon markets exist in China. China will lead the United States, and I'm not at all sure that, because they, for good or bad, there's not a lot of legal process there. You know, you don't have to permit a pipeline for 2,000 miles and spend 17 years of adjudicating, everybody's rights. And it has all the bad aspects of that as well as the good. But I wouldn't be surprised, and I would urge you to all look at that you're probably going to see more action out of China in environmental rights and trading than you will in the United States. That they will be a potential beacon for change. And then I'd quickly follow that by looking at India and its renewable energy markets, because they're totally dependent on monsoon flows, the farmers' water. It makes the subsidization in America look ridiculous compared to whatnot. So I take a thing, and if I was a young person, I'd focus, and all of you are, and if you were interested in this field, I'd be reading about China and what they're doing. I'd be reading about India. I wouldn't be reading about Washington, D.C. I would seek the opportunities where they are unexpected, because just like these developing nations realize, to Omri's point, you don't have to build underground cable for telephones. You bypass it with a mobile device. That these countries might take apocalypse when it comes to the use of markets, even though they're now, quote, not free market societies.
So how do markets deal with what Tom was talking about, or Dean was talking about at the beginning, concerns about wildlife? Right, natural concerns, aesthetic concerns, cultural concerns. I mean, there's this is just commodifying it, and so we'll just drain the lake if that is where the best best economic use is relative to these other values.
I think Tom's point's right, but again, look, I'm a terrible guy being associated with this university, both the privilege of this law school, and I'll be teaching in the spring on a course. I taught a course at Columbia University in 1992 called Environmental Finance, and it was the first course in a graduate school of business and dealt with the law school. And I had a student team that developed a market for spotted owls. Okay, this is 1992. This is 23 years ago, and a student project came up with dealing with this and came up with a way of preservation of endangered species through a market basis. I'm sure. Don't they do it in Australia with alligator eggs?
Well, the mantra is cap and trade, right? So the cap is the environmental component, and what's happening in Australia, they have one major system, the Murray-Darling, flows into the Pacific at Adelaide, Australia, and as a wine fan, I can't say a connoisseur, some of the best wine in the world is produced in South Australia. So the river has gotten very salty. It affects Adelaide, the wine industry. So since the 90s, we're into the 25th year right now, almost. What Australia is trying to do is set a base flow for that system, an environmental base flow, and then get people to trade the surplus and get rid of some of the more marginal but entrenched agriculture.
We're pretty close to the end of our time. If anybody had a quick question, we would take it. Okay. Otherwise, if you have questions, please come down and chat with our panelists. Thanks, everybody, for attending.